many of my students were approaching me and coming to me asking about some street literature and urban fiction titles. And I wasn't familiar with some of the titles that they had asked me about, but there were others that I was very familiar with. And that's actually, I realized that they were gravitating towards this subgenre, this new form, this new genre. And I wanted to know, what was it about this particular genre that they were attracted to? Because these were the same students that many teachers said were non-readers, were not motivated to read, and yet they were devouring this particular genre. And so they were definitely readers and they were definitely motivated. It was just something about plots, characters, and themes in these particular books that they were attracted to. And that's what has actually led me to want to pursue my PhD and, you know, having a focus with middle school students around their interest in street literature or urban, or what is known as urban fiction. Many people believe that street fiction is a new genre, and it definitely it's not new in the sense that, as far as storylines and themes, it has, you know, it's very much rooted in literature from the 19th century and the 20th century. If we're looking at the differences between contemporary and traditional, the difference is simply the cultural groups that are the focus within these particular texts. So, for example, Stephen Crane's Maggie, she was, you know, lived her life on the street, and, you know, the focus within that book is European immigrants. Whereas now when we look at contemporary street literature, we're looking at, you know, characters that are from the African American diaspora. African Americans, Latinos, and so for the most part, that is really the difference between the two. So you will find when you read contemporary street literature, it draws heavily on hip-hop culture. The focus is on AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, and so those tend to be the main differences. The literary continuum clearly, you know, allows us to see that there are more similarities than there are differences between traditional street fiction and contemporary street fiction. Yet there's still this divide as far as how we classify those that read contemporary literature versus those that read traditional literature. And, you know, strangely enough, or oddly enough, those that read traditional literature, or what has been identified as part of the canon, or what's been identified as this elite quality literature, you're considered to be a reader. You know, your reading or literacy practices are encouraged. You know, they're valued. Whereas if you're reading street literature that's more contemporary, those, you know, you're often, you know, you're not, oftentimes you're not considered a reader, or what you're reading is devalued. There's judgment made that it may not be quality reading or literature, and so because of that, you are then, through association, you're identified as someone that is a non-reader. As I mentioned earlier, the only difference between the two, besides time period, is the cultural group. In traditional street literature, much of traditional street literature focuses on the European immigrants. So you will find a lot of the focus, European immigrants living in the slums of New York City. That tends to be the setting. Whereas contemporary street literature tends to focus on characters that are from the African diaspora. The African Americans, Latinos, living in any urban setting. And so this is something that, you know, is important to discuss, that why has there been this difference between the two, when at the core there's more similarities than differences.
And how does this make the non-reader feel?
Right.
It's got to be demotivating.
oftentimes middle school students, I did a pilot study a few years ago, and middle school students realize more often than not that their reading practices, especially when they're reading contemporary street literature, they realize it's not valued. They often hide and read in isolation and privately. They realize that in order to be considered a reader, that they have to adhere or conform to society's standard of what's quality reading. And so no longer has it become the reader's job or their role to decide what quality reading is. It then becomes society's, makes those decisions, and then ultimately it labels, there are labels put upon them. So as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes students that are considered non-readers are also seen as students that are not motivated to read. But in actuality, they have mastered reading comprehension and decoding, but it's just that for many reasons, they may gravitate towards this particular genre. They may see connections with characters. The setting might be very familiar to maybe a setting that they grew up in. If they don't have a personal connection to a character, there may be a character in the book that reminds them of someone that they know. And so it's not about competence and ability. It's just more about preference and how we need to create spaces that supports and appreciates and values all, literacy or literary practices. Society values standard English or standardized English, or what has been identified as quality English. And if there is English that deviates from that, in any shape or form, then a lot of times some feel that it speaks to one's intelligence and it speaks to one's ability to communicate with others. And so I think AAVE, African American Vernacular English, or what is commonly known as Black Ebonics, many people don't see that as a dialect. And it is, it is a form it is a dialect. And like any other dialect, patois and things of that nature. But when we put it in the space of literacy, it does not, many people feel that it does not measure up. And so because of that, we associate one's intellectual capacity we judge them based upon that. I think as librarians, be it school librarians, public librarians, and even English educators, it is our job to embrace all forms of English and all forms of language. And I think oftentimes, teachers and educators of any sort, the children, the students, the middle school students have to feel like their literacy is of value and their language and way of communicating is valued. And so if not, they shut down. And then if you don't value the way one speaks, often it's almost like you're not fully accepting who they are. And so I think that's extremely important. And that's one of the reasons why I've come to the conclusion that, many people create separations between the literacies, and you're often, cast away and considered a non-reader if, you are familiar with AAVE. Many of the characters in contemporary street literature communicate using AAVE. And so if you can identify with that, there's oftentimes this sense of lacking intellectual merit. In order for you to expose middle school students to other types of literature, they have to first feel as though you appreciate the literature that they're currently reading. And so you cannot move forward on that and say, hey, let me expose you to this, but I don't really appreciate what it is you're reading right now. So there has to be an appreciation of what they're currently reading in order for them to feel comfortable and feel accepted and trust you enough to consider other types of literature.